Hello, my name is Buddy Childress, and I'm Executive Director of Needles Eye Ministries. We are really happy to have you with us today for our monthly speaker series. We hope you enjoy it.
Well, it's good to be with you all here again. It's been a few years. Yesterday, I began the series. It was an early breakfast, and Buddy said that I didn't speak long enough. And there's two groups of people that you don't want to tell that to: lawyers and people in the ministry, and I'm both. So you got problems here today. I hate to say it. Anyway, I want to speak on the subject of returning to the land and returning to the Lord. The ancient prophets said that the Jewish people would be scattered to the four corners of the earth, and then eventually they would return to the land of Israel. In fact, the prophet Ezekiel specifically said, who lived around the year 590 BC, said that first they would return to the land, and then they would return to the Lord. It was Jesus in around 30 AD who said that the second temple would be shortly destroyed after his death, that the Jews then would be taken as to the nations, and Jerusalem would be controlled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And then they would come under Jewish control once again. And the Apostle Paul, about 25 years after Jesus' ministry on earth, said that a partial hardening has happened to Israel, meaning that some of the Jewish people believed in the Messiah and Jesus, some did not, until the fullness of the Gentiles had come in, and then all of Israel would come to know the Messiah. And so it was that after this, 15 years after Paul said this, the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in 70 AD. And just as Jesus said, the Jewish people were spread to all the nations of the earth. And in fact, from that point until today, observant Jewish people pray every day, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, it would be as if I cut off my right hand." All Jewish people all over the world at Passover, at the conclusion of the Passover Seder, say, "Next year in Jerusalem," because there's a heart cry of the Jewish people to go back to their land. From the year 70 until the late 19th century, the Jewish people spread further and further away from Jerusalem, so that by the 19th century, there were large Jewish communities in both Americas, in Australia, New Zealand, China. In fact, as far away as you could get from Jerusalem, there were Jewish communities. And then suddenly, right around the same time, there were small numbers of Jews that began to return to the land of Israel. Interestingly, those groups that returned were not religious Jews. They were mostly secular Jews. Really, because it's similar to what the prophet Ezekiel said long before, that first he would bring his people back to the land, and then he would bring them to the Lord. As we all know in our recent history, 1948, Israel became an independent nation for the first time in almost 2,000 years. And since then, as we all know, they fought numerous wars for their existence. In 1967, Jerusalem was retaken back by Israel and once again came under Jewish control. And just exactly like Jesus said was going to happen. Now, the Apostle Paul, from what I mentioned earlier, had suggested that once Jerusalem was retaken back by the Jewish people, that Jews would return to the Messiah. They would come to know Jesus as the Messiah. Well, interesting, in 1967, when Jerusalem came under Jewish control again, there were no Messianic Jewish congregations anywhere in the world. Today, there's about 1,000. There's at least 150 Messianic Jewish congregations in the nation of Israel, and over hundreds of thousands of Jewish people have come to know Jesus as Messiah since then. What has happened? Very simply, the Lord said that this was going to happen, and so it's happening. That's the reality. Now, I remember 1967. I remember the war. I remember the Six-Day War because I was in high school at that time. My family attended a Reformed synagogue in Washington, D.C. And I remember the war because the Jewish community of the Washington area was called to gather together for a rally for Israel during the middle of the Six-Day War on the Capitol lawn. And so we were all standing there on the lawn listening to various speakers during the war when suddenly the announcement came out over the loudspeakers that the Israeli Air Force had destroyed the Jordanian Air Force. And of course, there was a tremendous roar of approval and so forth. So it was very dramatic. I grew up in a Jewish home in the Washington, D.C. area. I went to, we belonged to various synagogues, a conservative Jewish synagogue, Reform synagogue. I went to Hebrew school for over 6 years, was bar mitzvahed, as most Jewish people were, especially back then. But we were not a very religious family. I mean, we were involved in politics as far back as I can remember, and my father eventually served in the Nixon White House. And so our focus, of course, was on political life. And so again, we were not that religious, and even when I was in Hebrew school, the emphasis was really not much on knowing God personally, but it was rather on Jewish law, Jewish ethics, Jewish history, and so forth. So that's the focus. And so the reality was I was essentially an agnostic. My father's an atheist, so that's kind of the family tradition, I hate to say. And then 2 years later, 2 years after the Capitol Lawn experience in 1967, I was dating a Christian girl, and she began to tell me about this person of Jesus. Now, what she told me was that, told me about his miracles. He walked on the water and turned water into wine. And I remember hearing that for the first time from her, and I said, well, that's preposterous. I mean, no one believes that today. You know, today we're in the modern era. There's no such thing as miracles and so forth. And but ultimately what ends up happening was that through her and others, I was invited in my senior year in high school to a high school Christian group. My friends said, you know, look, come and experience something new. And I said, look, I'm not interested. Really, I'm not interested because I said, I've had years of religious training. I'm not that interested in it. And secondly, I'm Jewish, and Jewish people don't believe in Jesus. And they said, well, no, come. It's different. It's unique. And something that you've never experienced before. So I grew up in the 1960s, and so we all like to consider ourselves open-minded. And so I thought, okay, I'll go and see what it's like. It's really interesting. That occurred in 1969. And I still remember that fall day like the back of my hand as I walked through the threshold of a friend's home, packed with fellow students from our high school. And as soon as I walked through the threshold, I knew there was something different. I had no idea what it was. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. But I sat down, and all the people began to sing some songs, and they did a couple skits, and then the leader got up and began to talk about this person named Jesus, who I didn't know anything about. Didn't really understand anything that he said, but I do remember thinking that, wow, there is something here that I don't have. And I wasn't like one of these people that was like searching for truth or was completely bummed out about life. I mean, I was relatively satisfied with life, searching for identity and so forth, but not like searching actively for anything. But I did know that there was something there that I just didn't have. And so I thought, well, I'll go back the next week and see what happens. And same thing, same experience. And so finally the leader, after a few weeks, gave me a New Testament. I had never seen one in my life. And he asked me to read it. And so I brought it home with me. And I stuck it behind my books in my bookshelf because I knew if my parents found it, I would be in serious trouble. And so at night I would pull out this New Testament and began to read about Jesus and his life. And I was immediately captivated as soon as I began to read. It was like everything that I was looking for in life, everything I was trying to identify with purpose in life seemed to be reflected in his words and in his deeds. And so I was tremendously attracted to this person. And really over a period of time of a couple of months of reading the scriptures and going to these meetings, I began to believe. And my life began to really transform, began to change. Because I grew up in the 60s, as we all know, it was kind of a time where especially the teenage crowd was dabbling in, questionable activities, we'll put it that way. And of course, I participated in those as well. And I just stopped doing them. No one even ever told me anything that I was doing.